Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our next episode of World at 2111. I am Jason Tondro, your professor, and we're here to talk about Beowulf. Now, some good news for many of you. I know many of you have had a lot to do this week. You're worrying about midterms. You've had a lot of reading in our previous weeks. Beowulf is short, and more importantly, we're splitting it up into two pieces so that you'll have our first week to read about the first half of it, which is only about 30 pages, and then next week we'll deal with the next half. And you have some introductory material as well to read this week. So good news is that the reading load is lighter. Now, I did that on purpose, okay, because I know that you have exams to do, and you have been, working really hard the last couple of weeks. So here's the deal. I'll give you less reading this week, but your part of the deal is that you have to do it, okay? So let's get right into Beowulf. First thing you need to know is that I love this poem. This is like one of my favorite works of literature ever, and that's probably one of the reasons why we're spending 2 weeks on it, because I just like it better. But also, I'm going to be able to teach it better for you. Back when I was working in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, I translated every line of Beowulf from Old English to Modern English, and I've written on it. And I mean, I'm not one of the most distinguished scholars in the world on it or anything, but I know it pretty solid. So let's start off talking about it. And I also wanted to run through some introductory material, some preparatory material that I've prepared for you and that I have uploaded already to our website. The first place you might start is the introductory material in our book. You probably have already read it, or you're going to read it soon, and it's good. But the first thing you need to know is that you're going to find some disagreements with that introductory material and what I tell you, or maybe what else you might read on the poem. And it's important for us to remember that these introductory materials, these introductory pages in the Norton, are written by Beowulf scholars in this case, who's very well trained and chosen for a reason, and he's very good. But these texts are, in the case of Beowulf, we're talking maybe 1,500 years old. It's hard to say for sure, between 1,000 and 1,200 years maybe. And when the text was composed, it wasn't originally written down, and it took several centuries for it to be written down, and then it was copied multiple times before we actually got our single existing copy of it. The point of which being here is that we just don't know. There's a lot of the questions that you're going to have about this poem, like, well, what is it supposed to mean, and how do I resolve this contradiction in the text, and how come this book mentions God all the time, but it never mentions Christ, and how come it talks about Old Testament stuff, but never talks about New Testament stuff? Well, that's a really good question, and we're still talking about it over a very long time. So you'll see things like, for example, in the poem, there's a point where Beowulf brags about how he swam for 9 days across this ocean and fought sea monsters every step of the way, and was actually, because his armor was so heavy that he got sunk down to the bottom of the ocean. While he was on the bottom of the ocean, he was killing sea monsters with his sword. And it just sounds so fantastic, It sounds like something out of a Hercules cartoon or something. In our book, the introductory material suggests, well, maybe it's not really swimming. Maybe the word, because this is Old English, and we don't have a lot of context for this language. There's a great number of words in Old English that only appear in Beowulf. That's the only reason why we even know this word exists. So what does it mean? Well, we kind of have to figure out what it means from context and philology and so on. Well, anyway, maybe that word doesn't mean swimming. Maybe it means rowing, in which case you're fighting with your sword or you're fighting sea monsters while you're in a boat. Well, that's not quite as implausible as fighting sea monster with a sword while you're swimming for 9 days. Well, maybe. But maybe he was supposed to be swimming. I mean, but I think that there's a tendency with a lot of these fantastic literatures, especially Beowulf, to pull it back from the fantasy and try to make it more real. Like, well, what really happened? What is this poem really about? Maybe it's about impossible things. Maybe it's a poem about crazy stuff that is fantasy. And does that make it bad? I mean, just because it's about impossible things, it's about like a fairy tale character or a superhero or something. Does that mean that it's less good? In other words, do we make a text better by making it more realistic? You know my answer, right? My answer obviously is no. But to a great many people, the answer is yes. That the more realistic you can make the text, the characters, the better it becomes. Well, I argue that, a lot of this literature that we're reading is not designed to be read that way. It's not supposed to be realistic. It's supposed to be fantastic. And I think that we should embrace that with this text. Okay. After you've read the introductory material, I've uploaded a couple of other things. The first thing is Seamus Heaney's introduction to Beowulf. Now, our text uses Seamus Heaney's translation. This is an award-winning translation, won the Pulitzer Prize for it, justifiably so. It is amazing. It's wonderful. Yeah. Remember that all of these texts that we're reading were not written in the original language. The Latin, the Greek, the Hebrew, and so on. Even the New Testament, was written in Greek, large portions of it. Well, Beowulf was originally written in Old English, and translating that into modern English is a real challenge, because you have to weigh two different things, right? Preserving the meaning of the text. Let's get it to say the closest, most accurate, literal translation of the text, versus the poetry, because describing something in its most literal way is not the same as describing it in a way that sounds cool or that grabs our attention and our interest. In fact, sometimes they can be exactly the opposite. The most literal translation can often be the most boring. And Heaney worked very hard for years to create a translation of Beowulf that was powerful. And the trick here is, and not hard to read. Beowulf has a terrible reputation in literary criticism as scholarship and amongst college students as being boring and just a really bad book to read, just really boring. This is because of bad translations. There is nothing boring about this book. This book is about a guy who he's young and powerful, and he wants fame. He wants to live forever by being famous, and he comes in looking for monsters to kill, and he finds one, and he kills it, and then he thinks that he's won, but it turns out that the monster has like a sequel. He has an evil mother who jumps in at the middle of the night, and and Beowulf has to follow her back to her lair, which is deep underwater in a swamp. And he jumps down in the lake, and they have this. There's like this magical place inside the bottom of the lake where they fight, and then 50 years pass, which throws a lot of readers for a loop, and filmmakers don't know what to do with it, and people usually just cut it. But you can't understand this book without that 50-year gap. 50 years pass, and Beowulf is now an older king, and he's much wiser, and more importantly, the whole realm now has come to depend on him. In the first half of the book, he's like a rescuer. He's the cavalry that comes over the hill to help the old king who can't defend his own house. But in the second half of the book, he is that old king, right? He now is that old guy, and there's no one else around to help him. There is no cavalry. There is no young hero to come over the hilltop. And so when a dragon wakes up, because it has a treasure, and some nobody, some know-nothing, sneaks in there and steals a cup out of the dragon's treasure, and the dragon wakes up and starts rampaging across the land, Beowulf now realizes he is in the same spot that other king was in back in the first half of the book. And how does he react? What does he do that's different than what that king did? And does he learn, right? Does he learn from that king's experience? Well, so there is nothing boring about this story. It's great, but it can be very boring when it's translated poorly. So Haney's translation talks about his goals with the text, how he approached it, and it walks you through his ideas on why parts of the book are so compelling. And I think that you'll get it. To Haney, Beowulf is a horror story, and it uses elements of horror stories, like the house invasion, the beginning of the book when Grendel invades. It's a house invasion. We don't get it today because we don't imagine our houses that way, but that's basically what was being described. It's like, okay, you have everybody lives in this one big common house, right? You have like to briefly digress. The people that were writing and speaking Beowulf, they lived in these sort of long houses, and they were vaguely oval-shaped. And like, imagine a boat, like a Viking longboat, right? Except flipped over. So it's got kind of long wooden walls that are vaguely curved, right? And they come to a point kind of on each end. And this would just be flipped over, so that was your roof, and you had this kind of long, thin building. And this was the common house. There'd be a hole in the top for the smoke to come out of the fire, which is in the middle of the house. And then along the sides of the house, you would just build these benches, these long benches, and they would be like bleachers. And this is where everybody would just camp out for the night. They would, lie down with their wife and kids or whatever, and their animals, and pull blankets over them, and they would just sleep there all night. At one end of the house would be the Lord's seat, right? And at the other end of the house would be the only door, which was usually pretty narrow, and it was short, because it was designed to be defended by a single man who could defend that door, right? So if someone attacks your house, you just put one guy at the door, and he can hold off an army as long as he can stand there. Well, so this was the common house, and when Beowulf was told and recited, when we all gathered for tonight's chapter of Beowulf, some guy would be up there, and he would be the Anglo-Saxon storytellers were often called skalds, and S-K-A-L-D. It's a Norse word, it's a Viking word. And the skald would be surrounded by warriors and their family, and the lord would be there, and his queen would be there, his wife, and their kids would be there, and lots of hangers-on, followers and servants and so on, maybe some slaves captured in battle, and the skald would pick up where he kind of left off the night before, and this is a story for warriors, for warrior men, written by warrior men. And if that sounds familiar to you, that's because it's very much kind of in that line of the Iliad, but what we're going to find out is, and this is a big deal for people who first try to read Beowulf, is that the values and virtues which are raised up in Beowulf, which are considered the ideal virtues and values of people of the Anglo-Saxon culture, are not the same as the values and virtues of, say, Achilles or Aeneas, right, or Jacob. And this made it really hard for us to get Beowulf for a long time. We just didn't understand it. Now, this is leading us into a second article that I posted for you. It's called The Monsters and the Critics. It is the most important article on Beowulf ever written. And it was written by J.R.R. Tolkien. Yeah, him. The guy that created Middle-earth and elves and hobbits and wizards and all that stuff. Tolkien was an English scholar, a philologist, that is a scholar of language at Oxford. And he loved that Icelandic poetry and saga, the stories of Denmark and Norway and Sweden and Finland and all that stuff. And that's where the roots of Beowulf are. For a little history lesson, the people of Denmark and the Vikings, right, essentially, around in the 5th century or so, they were raiding the northern coast of England. We're talking about Scotland and those islands up in there. And they would raid, and then they settled, and they just decided to camp out there. And pretty soon they had conquered about half the northern part of England. And this area was called the Dane Law, because that was the area where the law of the Danes ruled, right? If you're in that area, you're in the Dane Law. You're in an area of England ruled by Denmark. Well, the events that you read about in Beowulf take place sometime around the 5th century. We know this because there's an event in Beowulf which we have historically dated from another document. It's referenced in another event that's a history that we can accurately date. So we know that the events of Beowulf take place around the 5th century. But the poem itself was probably not composed until sometime in the 700s, maybe, during the reign of a famous Anglo-Saxon Danish king, Northern Anglo-Saxon king, whose name was Ethelred. That's the name that they called him. That was his nickname, Ethelred the Unready. Ethelred was his reputation as king was that he was constantly getting surprised. He was never ready whenever people invaded him. He never had his army ready, and he would always get ambushed. So this created his nickname. He was Ethelred the Unready. Well, Ethelred was probably king when Beowulf was composed, and probably in his court. Ethelred is also famous because he himself translated a Latin book called The Consolation of Philosophy by a guy named Boethius. Translated Boethius from Latin into Anglo-Saxon, the language of what we sometimes call Old English. And this is the original language of Beowulf. Beowulf is written in Old English. Now, Old English is English. It is our language, but it's before the French invaded in 1066, right? So, and it's more like German than, like Old German than it is like anything else. It's not like Latin or the other Latin languages at all. It's insulated from those. We do still have words from Old Anglo-Saxon, Old English in our vocabulary. There are words like the and thing and that, right? These are the words that we still have, the basic, essential words that we use all the time. But these basic words in our language, we get from Old English. Well, anyway, so then, at some point, Beowulf was written down. The story of Beowulf was written down. We don't have that book. It was then recopied time and time again, from original to something else, and then from that book to someone else, and that book to someone else, until sometime around 1000 or so, it was written down, probably for somebody who had ordered the book. Now we're getting into stuff you guys don't need to know about the way that books were made in the Middle Ages, but essentially you had like a menu, and you would pick, well, I want a copy of that, and I want a copy of this Beowulf, this monster hunting story, and I want a copy of this journey, this travel book that this guy wrote about when he went to Constantinople, and I want a copy of the Gospel of Mark, and I want a copy of this bestiary, list of like monsters and stuff, and I want this story, this book here about plants and their medicinal purposes. And I want you to take all these books together and sew them up in one cover, and then I'll pick it up in 6 months. And someone made one of these books, a miscellany. That's where we get the word miscellaneous. That's where we get. Someone ordered this miscellany, and it was made for them. And it has this copy of Beowulf in it. Well, why is this important? Because that's the only copy of Beowulf to survive anywhere, is that copy in that miscellany. And it was put in this book, and it sat in a monastery. We don't know how it got in the monastery. Whoever ordered it may have bequeathed it. They died. The books went to a monastery. We don't know. It sat in the monastery until King Henry VIII. Yeah, that guy. Oh, I'm Henry VIII. Oh, I am him. King Henry VIII shuts down all the monasteries in England because he decides that he's going to create the Anglican Church. He wants a divorce. And so he cancels out all the monasteries, and he takes all of their money, and he also takes all of their books. Well, he didn't want the books. He wanted the money. So what does he do with the books? Well, he gives the books to this guy who promises to build a library with the books in them. And this is the Cotton Library, named after the guy Cotton who created it. And Cotton inherited all of these books from all the monasteries in England. So suddenly he was the biggest librarian in the world. In England, excuse me. The biggest library in England. So he builds all these shelves and he puts all the books on them and he organizes them by Roman emperor. He puts busts, like the sculpture of just the head. He puts busts on top of every bookshelf, and he indexes every book after what shelf it's on, how far from the left it is, and under what emperor's head it rests. And we still use this indexing system for these books today. It's wild. Well, anyway, so under Emperor Vitellius, on the first shelf, 15th from the left, there's this book. And it's got the only copy of Beowulf in it. Well, in 1731, the library catches on fire. And there's priceless, irreplaceable books in this library, like the most beautiful copy of the Gospels in English, the Lindisfarne Gospels. All kinds of the only copies of all kinds of valuable texts, and this library is burning. What do you save? You're the librarian. What do you save? Right? And if you look in your book, you can actually see, it's in the color insert section. Right there. Here. This is the first page of Beowulf. And you see this? That's where the pages were on fire. The pages were burning. Right? We've lost like the last letters of some of these words. And there's a few spots in your text where you'll just see just a couple of spots. ... Right? Up in smoke. This book came so close. So close to destruction. Think about all the copies of it that might have existed before now. We know that it was copied multiple times, so people ordered it. Who knows how many there were? Dozens? Hundreds? Gone. Last copy. Going up in smoke. It's kind of a miracle that we still have this book, when you think about it. It's kind of cool. Anyway. Well, so then we rescued it. And the trouble is that we didn't really start to study this book, and we didn't really realize that it was in there until sometime in the 1800s. And then when people first read it, and they read it in Old English, because we just sort of, figured out what Old English, how it works, and so on. And we read it in Old English. People were like, well, it's not very good. There's nothing interesting about it. It doesn't fit our ideas of, it's not good poetry. It doesn't rhyme. It doesn't seem to be about high themes. It's about this guy killing monsters, fights a dragon. It doesn't seem to be about a people settling a new land. It's not like it's no Aeneid, right? It's not about war. It's not the Iliad. It's not about a guy questing to be reunited with his home. It's not the Odyssey. And people just kind of dismissed it. Yeah, it's not worth reading. And then Tolkien got it. And Tolkien had a deep love of the Scandinavian literature that Beowulf came from, that its roots are in. Because although it was written in northern England, these people were Danish. They were Vikings in their blood, and they told stories, not about things that happened in England, but when they told stories to each other, it was all about things that happened back in the home country, back in Viking land, back in Denmark. And he loved that literature and that culture, and he understood it in a way that other people didn't, and he didn't immediately dismiss Beowulf just because it wasn't like the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Aeneid. And he said, look, your problem is that you're doing it wrong. You're taking the Beowulf and you're trying to compare it to things that it's got no relation to. Of course it's not Greek poetry. Of course it's not Roman poetry, because these guys didn't know what Greek and Rome was, right? They had their own traditions. Well, yeah, it doesn't rhyme. You're right, it doesn't rhyme. It alliterates instead. An alliteration is, right? It's got like a recurring sound, like a th sound, or a k sound, or a ch sound, or whatever. An s sound that recurs 3 times in every line. Yeah, it doesn't have like a set number of syllables. It's not like iambic pentameter, right? To be or not to be, that is the question. It doesn't have that. Instead, it doesn't matter how long the line is, as long as it has these three alliterations, two and then one. You're right. It's not about a great people or about a settlement or these what you think are, but it is about high themes as the Anglo-Saxons thought of it. And that 50-year gap in the middle that you guys dismiss because you think it doesn't make any sense is critical to understanding the poem. And we talked about this a minute ago, right? It's not just a story about a young hero out to make his reputation. And it's not just a story about an old king who goes to fight a dragon knowing he will die. It's about the guy who starts off as A, but grows and seasons into B. It's about change of character. In high school, a lot of people read Beowulf. More people have been reading it lately because Henry's translation is so good, and you've been reading the whole thing, and that's great. If you've read Beowulf already, you are prepped for this. But read it, look it over again. You won't be sad that you do. But people used to only read up to the first monster. They would read up to the death of Grendel, and then they would stop. That's kind of where we're getting to today. We'll just talk about the first half. But then they stop. Well, you've lost half the meaning of the poem, more than half, because Beowulf as a poem is more than just a guy fighting a monster. You've got to get the second half to get the payoff. You got to get the payoff. The payoff is not killing the monster. That is not the payoff. It feels like the payoff because it feels like a climactic action movie moment, but that's not what this poem is about. Okay. We've walked through a lot of the introductory material of the book. The one other thing that I want to talk about before we pause is this notion of the influence of Christianity and pagan religion in the book. This is a very complicated topic, and there's no clear answers. And your introduction makes it sound like we understand everything that's going on about the people and the role of Christ and religion in this book, and we don't. Okay, so don't presume that this is a settled question, because it's not, and it probably will never be. But the book poses a lot of interesting questions, some of which we've already mentioned. The person who wrote the book down, who wrote Beowulf down, was probably a monk. He knew the Bible, and he references the Bible. So, for example, the monster, Grendel, is referred to as one of the kin of Cain. That Cain, after he was exiled, right, for killing his brother, that Cain wandered and sired a whole brood of monsters that were all his offspring and children, and they were all trolls and ogres and witches and these monsters, and they're all his relatives, his children. There's also plenty of references to God. Beowulf thanks God for his victory, for example, and Beowulf meets the king of the kingdom where Grendel has been ravaging, and that king, whose name is Hrothgar. These names are kind of a tongue twister. Hrothgar, often invokes God and thanks God for Beowulf coming and all kinds of things, right? But at the same time, there's references to what we would think of as pagan worship. And there's a famous moment in the first part of the poem, and Heaney calls this out in his introduction. I think it's worth another good reason to read it. Where at one point the poet is talking about the people in Hrothgar's kingdom, that they remembered hell, that when they're hard pressed by Grendel, and it seems like nothing they can do will get rid of the monster, they stop praying to God and they go back to their old pagan gods. They start sending up smoke and burning sacrifices to the other gods that they had before God. Moments like this is where we try to decipher, okay, so what's going on here? Are we talking about a culture that's maybe in transition, that's moving from a pre-Christian to a Christian faith? And maybe there's still some people that think, well, you do what you want to do, but I'm going to stick by the old ways because that's the way we've always done it. And maybe there's people that backslide once in a while. And maybe our understanding of Christ and Christian faith isn't very clear yet. Maybe we're still in a time period where a lot of Christian ideas were still up to debate. Maybe this explains why, for example, we mention God plenty of times in this book, but we never mention Christ. There's no reference to the Gospels, to the New Testament at all in this book. Isn't that weird? Right? Well, how do we resolve that? So keep your eyes open for this, and I'm not saying you're going to have an answer for it, but I think it's one of the things that makes the book most interesting to read, right? To think about these people maybe being in this state of transition. We have this idea like, well, you're either Christian or you're not. Well, it's more complicated than that, right? Maybe it's not that easy. All right, let's pause right there. We've touched on a lot of the important topics, and then when I come back, we'll start actually in on the first part of the poem, and I'll try to answer some common questions that people have when they first start to read, and we'll work our way up through the actual killing of Beowulf, the killing of Grendel, and some of the events that happen afterwards. Okay? All right, folks, we're back, and we're going to start off at the beginning of the poem. Haney is trying to write, and these are his lines, poetry that means business. He's writing poetry for physical, upfront, matter-of-fact people. And so he's trying to find vocabulary that suits them. There are family trees in your book. There's an image of that on 111, and I've also copied the family's tree, which is essentially similar, very similar, from Haney's book, which is in the collection of Haney's notes, Haney's introduction. There's 3 tribes that are important here. The Danes, which are the people of Hrothgar. The Geats, which is where Beowulf is from. The Geats. He is not their king. He is not their leader. Their leader is Hrethel. But we won't meet him for a while. We won't meet him until next week. And then finally, there is the Swedes. Now, we never see the Swedes, but they're a threat. They're a menace. And so they're important to us as an offstage presence. And we begin the poem with the history of the Danes. This is immediately confusing because one of the Danes is named Beo, B-E-O-W. And a lot of people read that and they think that it's Beowulf. It's not. Bottom of 112. Beo's name was known through the north, and a young prince must be prudent like that, giving freely while his father lives, so that afterward in age, when fighting starts, steadfast companions will stand by him and hold the line. Behavior that's admired is the path to power among people everywhere. All right, now why did we just read that? Remember that as you read, we're learning about the civilization and the people that this poem is set in and that the audience was. Beo is the son of the king, whose name is Shield. Shield Sheafson, he's introduced in line 4 of the poem. Shield has a son named Beo. As Shield gets old, when he's young, he's a fighter king, right? He's a warrior king, and he's designed to be a role model for his people. But as he gets old, he's no longer able to do that. So how does he keep loyalty of the people in his company, in his hall? The answer is he rewards them with generous gifts. This is a pre-monetary economy. There is no coin in the Anglo-Saxon culture. Everything is treasures, works of art, works of jewelry, often things that you can wear on your body because you carry it with you. You carry your wealth with you all the time. So you have necklaces or armbands or helmets or suits of armor, like chainmail, right, which was the most advanced armor of these people. Or you have swords and shields and rings and these objects of gold or silver with jewels on them. This is your wealth. And the economy of the Anglo-Saxon people is one of the exchange of these gifts. Okay? So, the king conquers lots of people, takes their stuff, right? But then he dishes out that stuff as a reward to his warriors and followers. And the more he gives out, the more generous he becomes. The more his reputation grows, and the more people come to him because he's very generous with his gifts. He'll make you rich. A young prince must be prudent like that, giving freely while his father lives. The old father's getting old. The young prince gives out all the wealth. So that afterwards, in age, when fighting starts, and the young prince has to inherit, all those guys that were paid, that were bribed by the prince's father, now are loyal to the prince. Right? You're going to see a lot of anxiety in this poem about things like lines of inheritance, how the people stay safe. There's no law here. The law is whoever's got the most swords, right? We're dealing with the culture that didn't have a central government, that didn't have an established federal system, you know? So there's a lot of fear. The world is dangerous. And how are we going to make it from one generation to the next? And you need a good king, but what makes him good? Is it just that he's a great fighter? No, because everybody gets old, right? Even Shield gets old. And as he gets old, he needs to build loyalty through generosity. And then everybody feels a loyalty to each other and a kinship with the king because he's the one that made them all rich. And then when the king dies and the young son takes over, they're still loyal to that. Because that's the moment of tension, right? When the old king dies and somebody else says, well, screw it, I'm just going to take over, right? How do you prevent that from happening? You create bonds of loyalty through wealth and generosity, okay? This is very practical stuff by a people that were afraid that time was going to take away everything they owned, right? Behavior that's admired is the path to power among people everywhere. Boy, is that true or what, right? 700 AD. If you want to become a powerful person, behave in a way that other people admire. This is an intensely ethical book. Beowulf is teaching us how to be admired, how to be good people. And the argument is, well, if you want to be admired, you've got to do things that are worth admiring. You've got to have virtues, and you have to have a resume, right? So what does it take to be that kind of person? What does it take to be the guy that everybody remembers, the guy that people want to follow? Beowulf's going to be one of those guys. So let's look and keep our eye on him, and at the other people that have that power and authority in this world, and ask ourselves, what have they done? Okay? All right, so this guy, Beo, if you use your family trees, Beo is not Beowulf. They're separate. In fact, they're not even related. Right? You're going to see that the poet has a habit, and it's I want to say ever present. It's virtually pathological. Page 114. So our current king, we get through the family line to the current king, whose name is Hrothgar. I mentioned him before. Hrothgar. Hrothgar is fabulously wealthy. He's got this big kingdom that he has helped to conquer, and his father and his father helped to conquer, and he's the most successful guy around in Denmark. He's the king of the Danes. He's often referred to as king of the spear Danes or the shield Danes. The Danes. And he builds a house. He builds a magnificent hall to honor, to show off, and to celebrate the greatness of the Danes. And this hall is called Heorot, Heorot. It means heart. Not heart like beating heart, boom, boom, but like a stag, like a male deer. Right? Heart, just another word for a stag. So presumably it was decorated with lots of antlers, right? Because it's named stag. Right? So it's probably got antlers on the front or filled with antlers on the inside, probably from numerous hunting expeditions. But it's described, it's resplendent, and you can see it on 114, about line 78. Heorot was the name he had settled on it, whose utterance was law. He, whose utterance is law, Hrothgar. Nor did he renege, but doled out rings and torques at the table. This is the generosity we were just talking about. He's known as, like, the ring giver. That's one of his nicknames, right? Because he's the source of all wealth. The hall towered, its gables wide and high, and awaiting a barbarous burning. That doom abided, but in time it would come. The killer instinct unleashed among in-laws, the bloodlust rampant. The poet, and we don't know who wrote Beowulf, we just call him the Beowulf poet. The poet sets up this magnificent hall, and then as soon as he does, he tells you, and it's all going to burn to the ground. This is a very fatalistic poem. Everything good in this poem is foreshadowed as meeting its eventual destruction. As soon as we get the big house, we're told how it's going to burn to the ground. Remember we were describing how these houses are constructed? They're, vaguely kind of shaped like a seed pod or something. And it kind of like an oval, but it's got like the Lord's seat at one end, and at the other end would just be a door. Well, these families and clans were constantly fighting. And we talked about before that there's no real law. The law is whatever your family can arrange. They had a system of laws, like if the Hatfields kill a McCoy. So the McCoys say, well, that's not right. We're going to take you to court. And the Danes, these people had courts. They were called things. That's actually that was the word, a thing. And they would have the thing, and everybody would get together, and somebody would decide, okay, yeah, you're right. You Hatfields, you killed a McCoy. So you owe the McCoys a vast sum of money. It was called a weregild, or a blood price. You owe the McCoys 1,000 gold pieces or something, right? You owe them all this money. Well, I shouldn't say gold pieces because there's no coins. You owe them 12 cattle and a bunch of other treasures, and some gold necklaces and 12 suits of armor and some swords. You owe them all this stuff. But how do the McCoys get that stuff? What's the implementation of the law? What's the enforcement? They have a judgment. But how do you enforce it? Well, the answer is you get all your fellow McCoys together, and you go down there and you take it. And either the Hatfields give it to you because they realize that you're going to kill them all if they don't give it to you, or they refuse to give it to you, and there's a fight. And this is how the law was done. Your ability to enforce the law is directly dependent upon the number of friends and family members you have. The number of people you can call up to say, help me enforce my right. The king didn't enforce that. That's up to you and your buddies, you and your gang. Well, so How would this happen? How did these people fight? This is not irrelevant to our poem because there's a lot of fighting in this poem, and these people feel threatened all the time. Well, the answer is you would go to their house, and you would try to catch them in the house. Like maybe they're feasting or something, or they're sleeping. And then what do? Well, you can't attack the house because, as we described, the houses are virtually they're super defensible. You've got one little door and one guy standing at the entrance. And you could have 50 guys, but, if you can't get through the door, it's pointless. So you don't go through the door. You set fire on it. Right? And you stand back and you light the house on fire. And it starts to get pretty smoky in there, and finally they have to run for it. The people inside the house have to run, or they stay in the house and die. And as they run out of the house, you kill them. The hall towered, its gables wide and high, and awaiting a barbarous burning. That doom abided, but in time it would come. The killer instinct unleashed among in-laws, the bloodlust rampant. It's exactly what's described here for Heorot. Keep your eye on this because you're going to see it time and time and time again in this book. Somebody great will show up, or something awesome will happen, or some building will be built, or whatever. And someone will say, you'll find some piece of treasure, like some beautiful gold necklace. And then the poet will tell you, and the next guy that wore it died a hideous death. Right? Okay. You'll see a lot of creative use of language in this poem. Phrases like the whale road. What is the whale road? Well, imagine if you were a whale. What would you think of as the road? The ocean is the whale road, right? Or when Hrothgar is described as the helm of his people. The helm of his people. Well, there's a protective sense. He's a piece of armor, protecting the people. But he's also not just any piece of armor, he's the head. Right? These phrases, things like the whale road or the helm of his people or so on, are called kennings. They're just little turns of phrase that are kind of like little mini riddles, right? Designed to let you have to try and figure it out kind of as you were reading. And they were designed to show off how smart the poet was and how smart you were for being able to know what he was talking about. Okay. Pretty soon we get the introduction of Grendel, whose name actually means little grinder. Like presumably you're talking about his teeth. He grinds up bones in his mouth. But the L ending means little, like junior, like grinder junior. He's the little grinder. And it's probably a satirical nickname because he's huge, right? Like you would call some monstrous guy tiny, right? Then a powerful demon, a prowler through the dark, nursed a hard grievance. It harrowed him to hear the din of the loud banquet every day in the hall, the harp being struck, and the clear song of a skilled poet, telling with mastery of man's beginnings. How the Almighty had made the earth a gleaming plain girdled with waters. This sounds familiar to us, doesn't it? Yeah, he's quoting Job. But let's get back to this for a second. Let's rewind a little bit. Okay, so Grendel can hear the people in the hall in Heorot singing and praising God. And it's the singing and the harp playing that enrages Grendel. It harrowed him to hear the din of the banquet, the harp being struck, and the clear song of a skilled poet. In other words, it's that social compact, that it's community. The gathering of people just getting together and having a good time. It's that makes Grendel furious and need to kill. He's the classic outcast. He's the exile. We've talked in previous lectures and in our other things that we've read about the guy who's exiled from the community. And Grendel is this. Grendel is an outcast. He's Cain, right? He's descendant of Cain, who is the archetypal outcast. And Grendel is a loner, and he's doomed to be alone forever. And later her mother shows up, but we don't see her at this point. In this point of the poem, she doesn't exist. We don't know about her. Grendel's alone, and he has no one and nothing. And when he hears people, not just one guy, he hears people, multiple people in a crowd, having fun, eating and drinking and singing songs and telling stories and slapping each other on the back and telling jokes and say, hey, you remember when that time? Right? And it makes him so furious because he doesn't get that, right? He can't have that. That's the thing he can never have. And so Grendel goes, he hunts down, he goes to the house, and he breaks in, and he slaughters 30 people, and he eats them. He's apparently got some kind of a bag, like a sack, like a giant. It's a typical giant story. He's got a sack, and he grabs people, and he throws them in the sack and takes them home and eats them. Now, it's important for us to recognize that this is a huge problem for Hrothgar, because Hrothgar can't kill it, the monster. He can't defeat it. This is the king's job. The king should be able to defend the house against all enemies. And Hrothgar can't do it. And 12 years pass, and Grendel has basically taken over the house. He doesn't live there, but every night he comes to the house, and if there's anybody in it, Grendel kills them and eats them. Or eats them and then kills them, or whatever. And Hrothgar, you can read in the poem, Hrothgar has to basically move. He has to, he'd have like the central main house, Heorot, but he would have had other smaller houses, and there's a community here. Other longhouses like this, smaller, not as grand, where they would have lived before Heorot was built. And Hrothgar has to hide in those. And Grendel doesn't chase him. He only goes to the big main hall. But this becomes a recurring humiliation for Hrothgar. And it undercuts his authority as king. And he loses the admiration of his people because he doesn't follow through on the responsibilities of the king. This is a terrible weakness, and it's a flaw. And to the people in this society, they would know that it's not sustainable. If the king loses the loyalty of the people, then that means when the king dies, what happens? There's no clear heir. Nobody has any loyalty to him, and so they don't support whoever his offspring is. And everybody fights, and when everybody's fighting to be king, that means you're vulnerable to outside forces like the Swedes or the other groups who will just come in and conquer you because you don't have a defense. This was the great. We'll see this again later in the poem, where, when our king is weak, then outside forces can invade, and in this society, if not unlike the Greeks and the Romans and the Hebrews, if somebody invades you and they conquer you, you become a slave. And this is what the Danes are worried about, right? Their king is weak. And when the king is weak, that means that other people are going to take advantage of that weakness. Okay. Let's move on. So I'm on 116, about line 170, 175, talking about how difficult things were for the Danes. Sometimes at pagan shrines they vowed offerings to idols, swore oaths that the killer of souls might come to their aid and save their people. That's what we were talking about earlier, right? This people in transition. They're Christian now, but within living memory they were not. And sometimes they backslide because Christ doesn't seem to be helping them. God doesn't seem to be helping them out right now. They're being hunted by this monster for 12 years. God's not helping. So let's pray to somebody that might. That was their way, their heathenish hope. Deep in their hearts, they remembered hell. They remembered the old ways, the pagan ways, right? And they're swearing oaths to the killer of souls. The poet here is saying, well, God wasn't helping them. They didn't see God helping them, so they started to pray to the devil instead. Okay. Then we get the arrival of Beowulf. Beowulf shows up on the shore with a troop of men. He's not alone. Because a good warrior inspires leadership. He inspires other people to follow him, right? Because he's a good leader. That's what makes him a good leader, is that people follow him. So he shows up with a boat filled with men, all of whom are fighters. They're all warriors. And the people of the Danes are nervous about this, right? Because we were just talking about it. Their king is old and weak. He can't defend his own house. It's only a matter of time before somebody decides to jump on this. Maybe it's that guy. Maybe it's those guys in that boat right there. A dozen warriors and Beowulf in charge, they could do a lot of damage. They could maybe even take over. So there's a patrolman, like a coast guardsman, who's on a horse, and he spots them, and he tells them to halt, and he questions them, and Beowulf responds. He doesn't give his name at first, but he responds. I'm at about line 250, 258. So the Coast Guardsman says, who are you and what are you doing here? The leader of the troop unlocked his word hoard. This is a classic one of those kennings. He unlocked his word hoard. Okay, so hoard is like a treasure, right? So Beowulf has a treasure of words that he keeps locked, right? Like in here. So Beowulf is not just a great warrior. He's a great speaker. He's a great public speaker. And he gets questioned and interrogated, and he responds with eloquence. But the poet doesn't say that. He responded eloquently. He says he unlocked, like a chest, like a treasure chest. He unlocked his word hoard. I have an arsenal, a treasure of words, and I'm going to open them up on you. Right? The distinguished one delivered this answer. And he tells them about how, I'm a Geat. I'm one of the Geats. And I've heard about this terrible monster that's giving you and your people a hard time, and I have come here to kill it. Soon we find out that the Coast Guardsmen deliver this message, and the group travels to Heorot, and a messenger goes in to tell Hrothgar about this guy. And we find out that Hrothgar actually knows Beowulf. This is about line 372. Hrothgar, protector of the Scyldings, replied, I used to know him when he was a young boy. His father before him was called Ecgtheow. Hrethel the Great gave Ecgtheow his daughter in marriage. This man is their son. All right. So, ties of kinship and loyalty. Now, what we'll find out later is that Beowulf's father, Hrethel, was actually in trouble with the people back home. And he fled to Denmark, and Hrothgar gave him shelter. And in return, and then lavished him with gifts, as a good king does. And then Ecgtheow returned back to his homeland, and Beowulf. And then many years pass, and now Beowulf has come, possibly to repay that debt, right? In honor of the stuff that Hrothgar did for Ecgtheow before Beowulf was even born. It reminds us of that moment in the Iliad, right, when Diomedes and Glaucus meet on the field of battle, and Glaucus tells the story about his grandfather, and Diomedes says, hey, my grandfather put your grandfather up in our house. I'm not going to fight you today. We're old pals. Okay? This issue of hospitality and exchange of culture is still going on it's funny because a lot of people say, when we first read Beowulf, they're like, well, we don't really recognize the people. They're not like Greeks or the Romans. Well, in some respects, they are. And that's because of the danger of the world. The world was so dangerous that hospitality was almost universal. It's funny. Anyway, then Beowulf gives his resume, his kind of monster-slaying resume of great deeds. Beowulf does a lot of boasting. Now, those of you that have read Seamus Heaney's his original translation, it was originally published in its own book, and many of you might have read it in high school. It's a very distinctive cover. It's got a picture of a guy in chainmail, his head and shoulders, but there's no face. The chainmail covers the whole body. So all you really see is a profile of this guy, who presumably is Beowulf or maybe the poet, but we can't see his face. That's because Beowulf, we don't know who the poet of Beowulf is. Well, anyway, Heaney gives really nice little marginal notations throughout that book that are not reproduced here. Probably because the guy who wrote the introduction to this Beowulf doesn't agree with all of those observations and annotations. But Beowulf gives a lot of boasts, and he brags a lot. And he's a very proud man. He boasts about his accomplishments. And some of these accomplishments are fantastic. They are impossible to believe, right? But Beowulf stands by them. He would never admit to lying. So either he really did these things, and he's a superhuman guy. He can swim for 9 days and fight monsters on the bottom of the water, on the bottom of the ocean. Or he's the biggest liar you've ever seen. Now, it might be worth a brief digression to talk about the Beowulf movie that came out a few years back that a lot of you may have seen or have half seen. It's the one that looks like a computer animated film. It was written by Neil Gaiman, who is a big fan of Beowulf, but has some very specific beliefs about Beowulf. That movie is not the book we're reading. It departs from the book in some very specific ways, which we should probably talk about another time. In fact, we'll probably save for this conversation on Grendel's mother. But the main thing you have to realize is that if you try to write an essay based on that movie, you're going to fail. Because that movie makes some very important decisions about uncertainties in the text. It's not a stupid movie. There are some very problematic moments in Beowulf, some unresolved questions. We haven't got to them yet. And that movie tries to answer those questions in ways that only a Beowulf scholar will even get. But it tries to answer those questions. Well, that's fine and all, except that that's only one possible answer, and there's not really any evidence that that's the right answer. And I think we have to approach the poem with the questions intact rather than presuming what the answers might be. My old professor at UCLA used to say, books ask us questions. What questions is the book asking? Well, I think those questions are what's important here, not what answer we think. You'll see more what I'm talking about as we move on. Anyway, Beowulf gives lots of boasting, and he gives his great resume. He, bottom of page 121, when I battled and bound 5 beasts, and he talks about how all the monsters that he's killed. I have heard, moreover, says here's moreover, not only have I heard that you have this monster problem, I've heard, moreover, that the monster scorns in his reckless way to use weapons. Therefore, to heighten Hygelac fame, that's the lord that Beowulf serves is named Hygelac. That's the guy who leads the Geats. To heighten Hygelac fame, to make the guy I worked for more famous. Notice he's saying it's not for my fame, it's for Hygelac. And gladden his heart, I hereby renounce sword and the shelter of the broad shield and heavy warboard. Hand to hand is how it will be. a life and death fight with the fiend. Beowulf says, you gotta admire Beowulf's, sheer guts at this moment. He says, okay, yeah, you've got this monster, and it's been here for 12 years, and it's killed everybody who's ever fought it. He says, I'm going to kill that for you. I'm going to take care of that. But not only am I going to take care of that, I'm going to do it barehanded, right? He's like, okay, I'm going to take on this monster. I'm going to do it with my bare hands. I'm not going to, because the monster doesn't use a sword, so it wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be fair. So I'm going to not even use my weapons. I'm going to leave my sword and my shield, and I'm going to fight him barehanded. Yeah, okay. All right. There's a concept in Beowulf, the poem, that we haven't talked about yet, and that is this idea of weird. W-Y-R-D, weird. And it means, it's translated most frequently as fate or destiny. I'm talking specifically about line 455 in this case. No need then to lament for long or lay out my body, he's saying, if Grendel kills me, if the monster kills me. If the battle takes me, send back this breast webbing, he's talking about his chainmail armor, that Wayland fashioned and Hrethel gave me to Lord Hygelac. Fate goes ever, as fate must. Now the word in the Anglo-Saxon is weird. The Anglo-Saxon concept of fate or destiny, weird, is a little slippery, and it's worth pausing a minute to talk about it. Weird was this idea of your fate that was never good. Okay? It's always like your bad luck, your unhappy fate. And you can't slip out of it. It's in many ways a very pessimistic view. The trouble is that not everybody has a weird, but there is a kind of, if weird grabs you, then it's not going to let you go, and you all you can do is go down fighting. It's a pessimistic sort of view of the universe, and it's part of this discussion about how Christian religious values factor into the poem, because Beowulf is saying, well, if I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die. He does not say, and I'll go to heaven and get my eternal reward. He never says that. He's not at all concerned with that at this stage of the book. This is not unimportant. He's concerned with his reputation in this world. He is a very this world kind of guy. And this is really weird for us. It's hard to reconcile with the Christian elements of the poem. He thanks God for his victories, but he never says, oh, and then I'll get my reward in heaven. He's not concerned about heaven. He wants his rewards now, here. And that is portrayed as admirable in this book. His concern with this world, with living today, and doing the best you can with the bad fate you've been given. And this hooks up with Boethius, that guy that we mentioned a while ago. In King Ethelred, who was the king when Beowulf was translated, and was probably translated in his court, he had translated this book called The Constellation of Philosophy. And Boethius is a topic for another day, but the point of The Constellation of Philosophy is that you don't control anything in this world. You think you do. You think that you control your job or your family or your stuff, your wealth and your possessions. But in point of fact, all of those things can be taken away from you in a second. Your dearest loved one could be hit by a bus tomorrow. You could come down with cancer or leukemia. You could lose everything. You could be Job, right? You could lose everything. Boethius concludes that the only thing you can really control is your personal, moral, and ethical code. Because that's all up here. You control that. No one can take that away from you. And your loyalty to that and how well you execute your personal moral code is totally up to you. And you might get dealt the worst hand in the galaxy. But if you do what's right at each of those choices, that's the only thing that you really can control, and therefore, that's the only thing you can really be judged by, is what you do when the going gets tough. And this poem, Beowulf, was translated for a guy who had translated himself that book, The Consolation of Philosophy from Boethius. Maybe that's not a coincidence. Maybe this poem appealed to that guy because he sees something of Boethius, who was a Roman, by the way, in this book. So when Beowulf was talking about weird, he's talking about the bad chance, ill luck that happens to people, and they can't control it, they can't do anything about it, but they can still take actions during that bad luck, and what they do when they're hard pressed determines how we should judge them. Okay. Beowulf gives his long boast, and then he's responded to by a guy in the court. Now, your notes, I'm on page 123, describe this guy, whose name is Unferth, as a kind of court official whose job it is to get in verbal contests with Beowulf. Okay, that's bullshit. Excuse me. But Unferth's name, Unferth, means unwise speech or reckless speech. He is not doing this because he is Hrothgar's court-appointed interrogator or lawyer. He's doing this because he's a jerk. Okay? And he sees Beowulf, and he immediately blasts into Beowulf and says, well, I heard about this swimming contest you were in. Are you the Beowulf who took on Breca in a swimming match on the open sea? And this is the one we were talking about at the beginning of our lecture. We're talking about these impossible deeds that Beowulf talks about. Unferth is one of those guys that gets cut from most adaptations of Beowulf because people don't really know what to do with him. But he's a really interesting character. We should keep our eye on it. He shows up again later. Unferth says, I heard that you lost this contest. Breca beat you in a swimming contest. And Beowulf says, well, you heard it wrong. I had to rescue Breca because there were all these monsters in the water, and I had to fight and kill them all. And then I had to rescue Breca. But then the really interesting part comes. He says, but at least, Unferth, I'm not a family killer like you. Page 125, about line 587. You killed your own kith and kin, so for all your cleverness and quick tongue, you will suffer damnation in the depths of hell. Right, so this should surprise nobody, right? That the biggest insult that Beowulf can give to this guy is, you killed your family, because people are so family dependent. You need family, your kith and kin, your family and friends, for everything in the society. And he's comparing him to someone like Cain, right? And therefore Grendel. You're a family killer. Now, who did Unferth kill? Did he kill a brother? Did he kill a father? At this point in the story, we don't know. And he accuses Unferth of being a family killer, and that seems to shut Unferth up. Okay. Then there's more boasting goes on, and then we get the introduction of Hrothgar's wife, whose name is Wealhtheow. Wealhtheow, it's a tongue twister. Wealhtheow seems to pass among the crowd, pouring drinks. She acts as a kind of social bond. Like the king dispenses treasures. He's giving everybody wealth. she's giving everybody mead, right? And it's again a symbol of generosity, but it's also, when we have the drinking, she's giving out the alcohol, everybody drinks, and we all become friends. She's a kind of social lubricant, right? She keeps everybody friendly and happy. I know you've had a bad day. Here, have a drink, right? She's that girl. She's the pretty girl behind the bar, right? But she's also the queen. She's also one of very few female characters in this book, and she doesn't have a lot of screen time, but when she speaks, it's really important. So keep your eye on her. Grendel attacks. Beowulf's strategy when Grendel attacks is to have all of his men in the hall. Hrothgar goes off. Hrothgar and Wealhtheow retire to their second home, right? Because it's dangerous in here. Beowulf and his men hang out in the hall, and they all pretend to be asleep so that they can lure Grendel in. And Grendel shows up, and he rips the door off, and he goes inside, and he grabs the nearest guy and bites his head off and kills him. And Beowulf still doesn't move. It's a really difficult passage. It seems weird to us that Beowulf would not react. I think the only answer is that it's all happening very quickly. Well, anyway, Grendel kills one, and then he reaches for Beowulf, and Beowulf jumps up and wrestles with him. It's a wrestling match, because remember, Beowulf's using no weapons. He's left his armor off and everything. And Beowulf, who's said to have the strength of 30 men, which is also Grendel's strength. Grendel is also as strong as 30 men. So Beowulf grabs him in an arm lock. Imagine him on Grendel's back or something. And he gets his arm underneath, and he's got Grendel in an arm lock. And Beowulf is so strong, and Grendel's ferocity is so great. Grendel's trying to get Beowulf off of him, and they start smashing the building apart. They break tables, and they break pillars, and the whole building starts to shake and shudder like they're going to destroy the house in the process. But finally, Grendel has to escape. He has to get out of this lock. And so he tears himself out of the lock. But Beowulf keeps the arm. And so in a sense, Grendel tears his own arm off. And he escapes. He runs out into the darkness. But he's left behind his whole arm and shoulder. His arm has been ripped out of its socket. And of course it's a fatal wound. I mean, he's bleeding. His arm has been torn off. And Beowulf has the arm and the shoulder and the hand, and it's all armor plated and scaly, and it's got huge claws on it, and it's invulnerable. We find out while this is going on, while this whole fight is taking place, Beowulf's men are also attacking Grendel. But then we get this really interesting moment. It's lines 799 to 803. We find out that no sword can hurt Grendel. His skin is so armor-plated that no weapon can hurt him. And so it's actually to Beowulf's advantage that he chose to wrestle the monster rather than fight it with his sword. Because if he had fought it with a sword, he would have lost. Right? Now, is that just good luck? Or did Beowulf figure this out? That swords are of no use against the monster? Depends on how you want to play it. But in any case, they hang up the arm as a trophy from the top of the house. And Hrothgar comes in with Wealhtheow, and they all celebrate the death of the monster. Let's pause there. We've got a little bit more to talk about, but I want to pause. We've been going on a while. So let's stop, and then we'll talk about what happens after the monster's dead. Okay, we're back for our last chapter today. We're going to talk about what happens in Heorot after Grendel is dead. There's a section in your book where it's all italics. This happens a few times in our book, and it's always very important. The first one's on page 132, where a singer, a skald, S-K-A-L-D, it's a Viking storyteller, singer-storyteller. A skald tells a story, a song, in the hall of Heorot. So you have a song within the larger song of Beowulf itself. Okay? It's the song within a song. And Haney, our translator, to make it clear that that's what this is, uses italics for this song within a song. We get the story of Sigmund and how he kills a dragon. Now, why is this story here? Well, Beowulf kills a dragon. But the dragon also kills Beowulf. Spoiler alert, right? For a poem written 1,300 years ago. The second Grendel is defeated, the minute that Beowulf is at his most glorious, the poet reminds us that Beowulf's going to die, killed by a dragon. Right? Magnificent house, going to burn to the ground. Great hero, going to die. The poet cannot allow us to think that anything beautiful and glorious in this world remains in this world. Everything great falls in Beowulf. It's inevitable. As inevitable as weird. Right? But there's something else going on here. That's what the poet is doing with this. He's foreshadowing Beowulf's death and his later heroic fight against the dragon. But the poet in the book, the skald in Heorot, is also doing something. He tells the story about how King Herorod's prowess declined, that his campaigns slowed down. What king could he possibly be talking about, whose prowess has declined and his campaigns slowed down? Hrothgar, right? The king was betrayed, ambushed in Jutland, overpowered and done away with. The waves of his grief had beaten him down, made him a burden, a source of anxiety to his own nobles. That expedition was often condemned in those earlier times by experienced men who relied on his lordship for redress, who presumed that the part of a prince was to thrive on his father's throne and defend the nation, right? This is how a good king operates. He's got a son who's powerful and who's a good warrior, and when the king gets old, the son does all the valiant fighting while the king lavishes everybody with gifts. Who presumed the part of a prince was to thrive on his father's throne and defend the nation, the shielding land where they lived and belonged, its holdings and strongholds. Such was Beowulf in the affection of his friends and of everyone alive. But evil entered into Heorot. He says, and Beowulf is like that prince who does all these great and valiant deeds while the king is old. The skald is specifically comparing Beowulf to the son of a weak king and saying Beowulf's doing what a good son should do. On the next page, Hrothgar adopts Beowulf. Right? This is cause and effect. The minstrel says, hey, King Hrothgar, you're old, and Beowulf's a great fighter, and everybody in the court is worried about you because you can't defend your own house anymore, but here's a guy that can. And Hrothgar says, yeah, I think you're onto something. Beowulf, I make you my son. So now, Beowulf, I adopt you in my heart as a dear son. Beowulf did not ask for this. He did not ask to be Hrothgar's son. Well, the hall is reconstructed on the pages that follow. Line 1000. Only the roof remained unscathed by the time the guilt-fouled fiend turned tail in despair of his life. Grendel fled the house, and they all presume he's dead. They talk about him as being dead because of the huge bloody trail. His arm has been ripped off. Surely he's dead. But he retreats to a lake where he comes from, and he goes down into the lake. But death is not easily escaped from by anyone. All of us with souls, earth dwellers and children of men, must make our way to a destination already ordained, where the body, after the banqueting, sleeps on its deathbed. We all die. We all go to the same place. And we're not talking about heaven. These lines don't talk about heaven. They talk about the grave as the end. We must make our way to a destination already ordained, where the body, not the soul, where the body, after the banqueting, sleeps on its deathbed. And we get lines like, the shielding, inside Heorot there was nothing but friendship. The shielding nation was not yet familiar with feud and betrayal. Not yet familiar. Right? The Beowulf poet is constantly undercutting every sign of happiness, peace, and contentment, and saying, yeah, they were happy then, but it wasn't going to last. We're not going to talk about that. I'm not going to tell you the story of what happened and how the family of the Shieldings eventually fell apart, but they do. All right. So then we get a second one of these songs within a song, and it's on page 136, and it goes for a few pages. And this is the so-called Finnsburg saga. We have another Anglo-Saxon book which tells this story in detail, and this refers to that. This is one of the ways that we can date Beowulf. The Finnsburg saga. And what you have here, and I'm going to skim through the events of the Finnsburg saga so that when you read this, it'll make a little bit more sense. You've got two different groups of people. The Danes, led by a guy named Hengist, and the Jutes, led by a guy named Finn. And the Danes invade the Jutes. They sail down to the Jutes' home, to Jutland, right, or Frisia, as it would have been known. They sail to Jutland or Frisia, and they invade. And there's a huge fight takes place, and the leaders of the different families are both killed. And Finn, who's the new leader of the Jutes, and Hengist, the leader of the Danes, they're both worn down by the fighting, and winter has come in. And they actually form a peace. They decide to settle their grievances. The Danes are the Danes have lost a lot of men, and we get the idea that for some reason they can't go home. Maybe their boats have been ruined. Maybe the weather's too severe. They can't get home. Well, so if they can't go home, they have to stay somewhere. And Finn decides, well, better that there are friends than that they continue fighting. So he also offers a peace. He says, look, why don't you guys just stay here? And we'll share our wealth with you. Every night when we give out gifts to all the local warriors, we'll give an equal number of gifts to you, and we'll spend the winter together. Well, this can only end well, right? And the whole winter passes with the Danes guests of the Frisians, the Jutes. And Finn lavishes them with presents. Now, there's another little wrinkle here, and that is Hildeburg. Hildeburg is Finn's wife, but she's a Dane. This is one of the reasons why the Danes invaded, right? She's a Dane. This is how kings would create alliances, right? They would marry off relatives and so on. Or maybe you just took her. Maybe Finn had just come out and they had just grabbed Hildeburg and taken her, right? Because we're not above that either. Well, anyway, the winter passes, but then the winter ends. And finally, one day, one of Hengist's buddies takes out Hengist's sword, which is called Hunlafing, right? Hunlafing. And he doesn't even say anything. He just puts the sword in Hengist's lap. And Hengist looks down at the sword, and he's been wanting to break the treaty, right? and the sword silently placed in his lap is his nobles telling him, his fellow warriors saying, okay, let's do this. Let's just paste him. And the fighting breaks out again. The feud breaks out, and the Jutes are killed, and Hildeburg is taken back to Denmark. Okay. Why is this story here? The book asks questions, right? It's not here for no reason. Why is this poem here? Well, rewind a little bit. Think about the events. You've got a skald, a poet in Heorot, with Beowulf and his men, his dozen men, all armed warriors, all tough guys, that are guests in the hall with Hrothgar, who's old and weak, and doesn't have a lot of fighters left because they've all been killed by Grendel. He's got people like Unferth, right? And Hrothgar has made Beowulf his son. Well, Hrothgar already has sons, right? It's unpacked for us in the lines that follow. Wealhtheow, the wife, gets up, and she introduces Hrothgar's sons. He's got two of them, and Hrothgar has a brother. He has a nephew whose name is Hrodolf. I know the names are confusing, but use your family tree. And what we're seeing here is a parallel between the invading Danes, Hengist's gang, who arrive in Jutland, and Beowulf and his gang, who've now arrived in Denmark. And Finn, the weak king, who tries to make a peace and tries to appease the guys who just landed in his house with a bunch of men, becomes like Hrothgar, who tries to appease Beowulf with lots of gifts. And the minstrel is saying, it's not going to last. They're going to stay here until they've gotten as much gifts as they want, and then someone's going to put a sword in Beowulf's lap, and he's going to draw it, and fighting's going to break out, and who's going to suffer? Wealhtheow, your queen, is going to suffer. And they're going to take her wherever they want to take her. Beowulf's not married. It's a poet singing a song illustrating an instability of the current situation. And Wealhtheow recognizes that. And I think the fact that Hildeburh is the victim of that Finnsburg saga is not unrelated to the fact that Wealhtheow is the person that gets up after the song is over and starts speaking. And she introduces Hrothgar's two sons and the nephew, and says, the nephew's going to take care of things. You have an heir. These children are your heirs, but they're too young. But the nephew isn't. And so when you get old and you die, Hrothgar's already old. When you die, your nephew will take care of things until your sons are old enough to run the kingdom. And isn't that great? And we trust your nephew. Hey, Beowulf, you're awesome. Here's all your presents. Now go home. Right? Don't stay here. Wealhtheow's speech is in 1170. Lines 1170. And she gives Beowulf this magnificent torque. And she pours him a drink. She gives him more presents. And the most resplendent torque of gold I ever heard tell of. It's this like solid gold neck amulet. Anywhere on earth or under heaven, there was no hoard like it since Hama snatched the Brozing's neck chain and bore it away with its gems and settings to his shining fort, away from Aromeric's wiles and hatred, and thereby ensured his eternal reward. Hygelac the Geat, grandson of Swearting, wore this neck ring on his last raid. Hygelac is Beowulf's lord. Beowulf's going to go home, and he's going to give this neck torque to his lord, who will be wearing it when the lord dies in battle. Because no good thing goes unpunished in this book, right? So Wealhtheow comes up, and then she says, she gives him all these presents. Take delight in this torque, dear Beowulf. Be acclaimed for strength. You've won renown, you're known to all men. And so, my prince, I wish you a lifetime's luck and blessings to enjoy this treasure. Don't let the door hit you on the way out, right? Because they're acknowledging the basic, they admire Beowulf, and they're grateful to Beowulf. But Beowulf's troop of invading men and guested in the household is a basic instability that cannot last. We appreciate all you have done for us. Here is every reward we can think to give you. Have a safe trip home. Because if you stay, my sons are going to wonder if they're going to get to inherit or if you're going to try and take over. And you've got a bunch of armed men, and our ranks are depleted. And, this cannot last without violence. We love you. Hit the road. All right, so we're going to pause there. We've done a pretty good job. We're going to stop at the first half. Now, what we've left off is the arrival of Grendel's mother, and then finally the dragon whole fight at the end. So keep up with your reading. We'll put up a quiz. And we should put one last quiz question. What is the name of Captain America? I'm wearing my Captain America shirt, so Captain America question. Oh, here we go. What was Captain America's occupation in the comics? What did he do in the comics after he was a soldier, like in the modern day? Answer: he was a comic book artist. Yeah, a little meta for you. All right, we'll get to the next half of Beowulf next time. In the meantime, I hope you're enjoying the poem, and don't be afraid to give me questions. Okay.